Now it's time to start tying several notions that we've discussed in earlier videos together. So you know about the idea of a biome, which is a major terrestrial or aquatic life zone. You know that ecosystems are tied to the abiotic factors of the environment. What is the annual average temperature in the environment? What is the annual average rainfall in the environment? Are there major fluctuations in the rainfall and the temperature in that location? Where are mountain ranges in that landscape relative to the largest water source in that landscape? These will determine what kinds of plant life are going to be most well supported in that location. And then once you have the plant life, whatever the dominant form of plant life in that ecosystem is, that will determine basically everything else about the ecosystem. So if the physical factors support cactuses, you have a desert ecosystem. If the physical factors support tropical broadleaf trees, you have a tropical rainforest. If it supports pine trees, you have what we call a coniferous forest. Coniferous means cone-bearing trees, so that's pines and spruces and firs and that kind of thing. So the abiotic factors influence the biotic factors. The temperature and the rainfall gives us the kind of vegetation that you're going to have in the location, and that will determine everything else. But here's the next little nuance to add on to it. The types of physical factors that you're going to find in a location are not randomly distributed across the planet. You're going to have hot temperatures around the equator, and the temperatures are going to be warm a little bit away from the equator, but not as hot as you have right at the equator, and they're going to be cooler as you move further towards the poles. You're going to have lots and lots of evaporation in areas where you have a lot of ocean. And it turns out that a location's latitude on the map is one of the most important determiners of what their annual temperature is going to be and how much precipitation they're going to have. The further away they are from the equator, the colder their annual average temperature is going to be. And the further away from the equator there are, probably less rainfall they're going to get. Although it's not a perfect determiner, because we have ocean currents, we have air currents, we have changes in the landscape which throw off that kind of perfect prediction that you might otherwise expect. So if you take a look at this map, this is color coding different types of biomes that we have across the planet. And you can see it's kind of patchy. Ecosystems show up in different types of patches across the Earth's surface, but there are clear bands. All of our deserts show up right here, just up north of the equator, right, in this band, south of Russia and Canada, but north of the equator. Right here is where we have all of our deserts located. Whereas coniferous forests, cone-bearing trees, pines and spruces and firs, you get all of them in northern Canada and northern Russia. The taiga is one of these big coniferous forests. I've mentioned a number of times before the kinds of trees that you find most commonly in Pennsylvania are deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are broadleaf trees that drop their leaves every fall. So oaks and maples and sycamores and cherries and those types of trees. And you can see that this is kind of lime green on the map, and you find some of these trees in Europe as well, and you find some of them over here in Asia, but they're all in this northern band in these temperate climates. These are temperate broadleaf forests, temperate deciduous forests, they're also often called. You can see that they're all kind of banded together at this one groups of latitudes here. The tropical rainforests are down here in the tropics. They're down here south of the equator and right at the equator. And you can see them here in Africa. You can see them here in South America. You can see them here in the islands north of Australia. But they are grouped together at these bands of latitude. So your geographic position on the globe is one of the big determining factors as to what kind of physical conditions you're going to find there, temperature and rainfall. And then those things determine what kind of vegetation will show up in that ecosystem. Why is this? Well, on the next slide, I have an image of the Earth, and it is rotating as the Earth does. This is the correct direction of Earth rotation. And this dotted line is the equator. And you can see that I have it tilting up and down, and that's accurate to what the Earth does as it rotates around the sun. It tilts up and it tilts down at this angle. Also on this diagram, I've indicated the angle that the sunlight is striking us at. And you can see that it is hitting the equator kind of directly at some points of the year, but the surface of the Earth is curved. So when it's hitting the equator directly, it's hitting the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere at a kind of oblique angle. You see how the surface of the Earth is curved away from the angle of the sunlight. And if the surface of the Earth is angled away from it, it's indirect sunlight. It's not going to be hitting it as strong. And if the sunlight's not hitting the surface of the Earth as strongly, it's going to be weaker. The warming effect is going to be weaker. So you're not going to get as much heat, as much sunlight at those points on the map. Also notice that it's tilting backward and forward. It's going up and down and up and down. And this is accurate. This is what the Earth does as it rotates around the sun. The equator moves up, and when it does so, it exposes the southern hemisphere to more sunlight. And when that happens, the southern hemisphere is in summer, and then it tilts down, and that exposes the northern hemisphere to more sunlight, and when that happens, the northern hemisphere is in summer. So whenever the northern hemisphere is in summer, the southern hemisphere is in winter, and whenever the southern hemisphere is in summer, the northern hemisphere is in winter. They trade places. However, the equator, being right in the middle, is always getting pretty good sunlight, pretty much year-round. So there's not a lot of seasonal variation at the equator, and that's why they have year-round warm temperatures. Also, if you take a look at this map as it's rotating, you can see that at certain points, the equator is just filled with ocean. There's no land covering it up at all. So not only is there a lot of heat and light striking this portion of the map, but this is where the majority of the world's ocean space is. So there's a lot of moisture in the air. There's a lot of evaporation happening at that location. This creates a system where there's warm, moist air rising at the equator, and there's cooler, drier air at each of the poles. Warm, moist air is going to rise, and as it rises, it's going to cool off, and it's going to spread out as the pressure drops. And when it spreads out, it's going to move towards the poles. So that warm, moist air is going to start drifting towards the poles. And this, the rotation of the Earth and the movement of this air, is what's going to cause trade winds. So this explains why you have warm, moist air rising at the equator, cooling off, and then when it cools off, you have a lot of precipitation, and that gives you the tropics right around the equator, and that's why you have tropical rainforests right down there at that belt near the equator. But then you have the air continuing to move towards the poles, and you have the temperate zones getting the rest of that warm air left over from the equator, and that you have these mixing air currents that are creating this nice warmer zone that's just outside of the tropic zones. And that's where we live in Pennsylvania. We live in one of these temperate zones. If it were not for the effect of the air currents mixing the moisture of the air and the precipitation, and the air currents bringing warm air from the equator up to the temperate zones, it would be much, much colder where we currently are. So temperate zones occur at latitudes between the tropics and the Arctic Circle, or the Antarctic Circle, depending on which hemisphere you happen to be in. And they generally have milder climates than the tropics or the polar regions. If you take a look at this map that I have, you can actually watch as the warmest band of the Earth moves from northern latitudes down to southern latitudes, and then back up during the northern hemisphere's summer, and then back down during the northern hemisphere's winter, and up and down. And that's because the Earth keeps tilting back and forth, but around the equator, the temperature always remains relatively hot. and at the poles it remains relatively cold. So it's only in the temperate zones that you really get this big variation in seasons. Therefore, the kinds of vegetation that we have in the temperate zones are specially adapted to deal with seasons. That's one of the big evolutionary pressures that are on organisms that live in temperate climates, is dealing with having a very hot season and a very cold season. I did mention the effects of landscape on this whole process in an earlier video, so I'll just briefly mention it again here. As you move up in latitudes, the air pressure drops off, and that has the effect of cooling air. And that's like moving either dramatically north in latitude, or if you're in the southern hemisphere, moving dramatically south in latitude. So that can change the physical factors of the environment. That can change what the composition of organisms is going to be. So if you move up a mountainside, you might get pine trees. You might get a lot of pines and firs and spruces, just like you would see up in the very most northern regions of Canada and Russia, because the physical factors at the top of a mountain are much more similar to those at very north latitudes, closer to the Arctic Circle. And this is because by the time it gets up to the top of the mountain, the air is cold and it's already lost most of its moisture. And you can see that on the picture on this right-hand side here as well. As warm, moist air moves over a landscape, if it gets up to a mountaintop, it actually has some trouble getting past that mountaintop because as it moves up, air pressure decreases. That cools off the air. This is just an effect of lowering air pressure. And then that causes condensation, so all of the rainwater falls on one side of the mountain, and only dry air can go past it. And this creates what we call a rain shadow, where you'll have a desert on the opposite side of a mountain range. So here is something called a climograph, and this will show up on your exam. So make sure you understand how this table is used. A climograph takes the two most important physical factors of an ecosystem and it plots them on the x and y axis. So on the x-axis we have the annual mean precipitation. That's average annual rainfall, so the amount of rain that you get per year in centimeters. On the y-axis, we have the average mean temperature, so the average annual temperature in degrees centigrade, Celsius scale. Scientists always use the metric system because, frankly, it's just a superior system for any kind of measurement which requires math. And in the graph itself, you have all of these colorful shapes. Each one of these shapes represents a particular kind of ecosystem and the range of physical factors that could exist, and you would still have that ecosystem able to thrive. So in order to have a tropical forest, in order to have a tropical rainforest, you would need to have relatively high annual mean temperature here. So you can see that, all right, here's 15 degrees Celsius, here's 30 degrees Celsius. So right here would be, 20, somewhere between 25 and 27 degrees Celsius is what this narrow band would represent. They're saying this needs to be somewhere in the area of about 26 degrees Celsius average annual temperature in order to get a tropical rainforest, plus or minus 2, let's say. If it's much colder than that, if the average annual temperature is down at 22 degrees Celsius, then you cannot have a tropical rainforest, is what this is telling you. Look, this shape does not extend down to this line. So it's saying that ecosystem cannot thrive, cannot exist at that temperature, because the dominant sort of vegetation that determines that ecosystem can't survive under those conditions. So you can't have a tropical forest at that temperature. Similarly, you would also need a lot of rainfall in order to have a tropical rainforest. It's right there in the name. It's a tropical rainforest. So you need an annual mean precipitation somewhere between 150 centimeters per year and 450 centimeters per year. And you know that if I were to say, there's a forest with an annual mean precipitation of 350 centimeters of water per year and an annual mean temperature of 25 degrees Celsius, well, that would put the dot right here on the graph, and there's only one ecosystem that could survive under those conditions, and that's a tropical forest. Same thing over here. We could take a look at this. A desert, what this climate graph is telling you, a desert can only exist in conditions where it's extremely dry, where there's low annual mean temperature, and relatively hot, where the temperatures are, well, at a minimum above 7 degrees Celsius, but going up as hot here as looks like maybe 24 degrees Celsius. What if we had basically the same range of temperatures but a little bit more precipitation? Well, the climate graph tells us that that would probably give you a grassland ecosystem. What if we had a little bit more precipitation? Well, we have two shapes actually a little bit further to the right of grassland. We have the coniferous forest down here and the temperate broadleaf forest, what I've called the deciduous forest several times, up here. So the main difference between these two is what the temperature is. Colder temperatures, you're going to get pines and spruces and fir trees, coniferous trees, cone-bearing trees. And then a little bit warmer, you're going to get a temperate broadleaf forest at those temperate climates, the ones where you have oaks and maples and sycamores and that sort of thing, trees that drop their leaves every cold season. If you have very low rainfall and very low temperatures a year round, then you get tundra ecosystem. These are areas with very little plant life, very small plant life, and a permanently frozen soil, what we call permafrost, year round. So these are, you find these in very, very cold climates. Now, this concept ties together a whole bunch of different notions that we've been talking about this semester. One, ecosystem diversity. We're talking about all of the different ecosystems that you could have, and this is actually honestly just a small number of them. Two, we're talking about how the abiotic factors of an environment control the biotic factors of an environment. Three, we're talking about how the dominant form of vegetation in an ecosystem determines what kind of ecosystem you have. Four, we're actually talking a little bit about evolution. Down here I have noted fitness is determined by the local environment, therefore the climate controls the dominant vegetation. It's not a coincidence that when you have hot, dry conditions, cacti are the dominant form of vegetation. If you were to plant every kind of plant that exists in a desert, only the cacti would be the ones that survive because they are the best competitors in that environment. And the reason is because over millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, any adaptation that was not useful to surviving in a desert was lost over time. And only the mutations and tiny little changes that were an advantage for deserts were retained. So they are specialized to work in deserts. They're specialized to survive in the deserts. And that is why the abiotic factors, the temperature and precipitation, can decide which vegetation is going to be dominant, because only the best competitors, the most fit competitors, are going to be the dominant vegetation in that location. And that's what survival of the fittest means. Those organisms best adapted to that specific environment will be able to survive and therefore reproduce the most. There's no single best organism. There's no single most fit organism on the planet. If you took a cactus and you put it in the tundra, it would die, right? It's not fit in that environment. Each of these organisms is extremely highly evolved, but only in the environment in which they are well suited. So we'll talk more about evolution specifically in a little bit, but I want to make sure that that concept it comes across early on, is that fitness only makes sense as a concept when you're talking in the context of the specific environment in which an organism exists. Now, to help you use this climograph, because like I said, this will come up on a test, let's do a sample question here. There it is. What kind of biome would you expect to find at 150 centimeters annual precipitation and an annual mean temperature of 7 degrees Celsius? So go ahead and pause the video, find that location on the climograph, and write down your answer. And actually write down your answer. Don't just wait for me to do it. Okay, hopefully you've unpaused the video now, and hopefully you did write down an answer, because what happens is if you did not write down an answer, you will convince yourself that you would have guessed correctly even if you would have been wrong, and you will then get it wrong on the test when it actually becomes time. Even if you get the question right, your brain will get some reward signals. It'll be like, yeah, I got it right, and that will reinforce what you know. And if you get it wrong, this is the best time to find out about that, not when we're actually taking the test. So, what kind of biome would you find at 150 centimeters of annual precipitation and annual mean temperature of 7 degrees centigrade? Here's the line for precipitation. This is at 150 annual precipitation, 150 centimeters. Here's the line for 7 degrees Celsius. This would be about 7.5, but it's right about the same spot. And this is the shape for coniferous forests right here. It is a very subtle shade change that they went with between coniferous forest and temperate broadleaf forests. Do remember that coniferous forests occur in colder climates. Think pine trees, think Christmas, right? Those are the colder climate ones, but that is the correct answer for that particular question. So, what are coniferous forests? Coniferous forests are dominated by cone-bearing trees, which are evergreen. Evergreen trees means that they have their photosynthetic components out year-round. They're constantly green. It doesn't specifically mean that we're talking about pine trees and fir trees and spruce trees. And by the way, the reason why I always say it like that is because pines and firs and spruces are different types of coniferous trees. Firs and spruces are not pine trees. Up here on this map, you can see where the largest cone-bearing forests are in the world. You can see up here in Canada, we have large tracts of boreal forest, and up here in the taiga in Russia, we have these large cone-bearing forests. And obviously we have pine trees in other locations. Like I mentioned, anytime you go up in altitude in the mountains, you will find some, but the largest coniferous biomes on the planet are way up at these northern latitudes right here. These are relatively cold annual average temperature. They do have some warm season in there, and decent annual rainfall, similar to what we would have around here, but just colder on average. The reason why this type of vegetation does well in these climates is because pine needles are thin and relatively thick compared to the surface area that they have exposed, and they're coated in that nice waxy coating. And this is all to prevent water loss and immediately freezing when exposed to the environment. Whereas broadleaf trees, like you would have on an oak, they would get damaged. All the photosynthetic components of them would get damaged if they were exposed to winter conditions for too long. So those oak leaves would become useless during the winter, which is why they just get dropped every fall. But pine trees, since they are adapted to northern latitudes, where, if you remember from the Earth tilting back and forth, those northern latitudes barely get sunlight for most of the year, so they can't afford to give up their leaves for half the year. So they need to have them out year-round. They have to be doing photosynthesis on a year-round basis. So dropping their leaves, not an option. So they instead have to have some sort of adaptation to deal with that cold weather environment. Therefore, cone-bearing trees are the best adapted for these extremely cold conditions, and they will outcompete broadleaf trees when the temperature goes cold enough. So that's why when you have moderate rainfall but relatively cold temperatures, you will get a cone-bearing tree. Because even if you have oaks and maples and things like that in this area, the cone-bearing trees will outcompete them for resources. They will be the most fit in that environment. Whereas in a temperate broadleaf forest, where you have warmer temperatures and you have seasons, so there's lots and lots of sunlight exposure for part of the year, and then very little sunlight exposure for another part of the year, the broadleaf trees, where they have those big leaves, they are much more efficient at gathering sunlight. So they can get way more photosynthesis done during that short period of the year during the summer when they're having their leaves out in full view, and then they can get so much done that they don't need to do photosynthesis for the rest of the year. They just go dormant. So temperate broadleaf forests are the ones that drop their leaves every fall, that change colors, and we like seeing all the pretty colors in autumn. The word of the day for temperate broadleaf forests is deciduous. Here, I'm going to write it out for you, deciduous. So same thought experiment as before. If you have some pine trees and some deciduous trees, and they're all growing, you plant them all in this field, but we have seasonal variation in the amount of sunlight, and we have pretty good annual average temperatures, a little bit more moderate, the deciduous trees, the broadleaf trees, are going to outcompete the pine trees. They're going to do better in this ecosystem. They will be the most fit in that situation because doing year-round photosynthesis is no longer a vital necessity. And just like the plant life is adapted to deal with the seasons, a lot of the animal life in these forests is also specially adapted to deal with the fact that there are seasons. So you take this fox as an example, it's got a winter coat and it's got a summer coat. It's adapted to seasonal changes. Now, one little note is that not every ecosystem is going to be dominated by a single kind of vegetation. For example, in this photo, you can clearly see that there are some pine trees intermixed with the deciduous trees. Different organisms can employ very different strategies for survival, or photosynthesis in this case, and both be very successful. So there's active competition going on in this ecosystem. Later we'll talk about the idea of succession in a forest, which is a slow transition where one ecosystem becomes another one over time. And I believe that's what we're seeing in this photo right here. It's a really interesting topic. So tropical forests, you can see that these occur at tropical latitudes, obviously. We already talked about how it has to be hot temperatures and very, very moist temperatures, lots and lots of rainfall. These are dominated by evergreen broadleaf trees. So we had evergreen trees, which were pines and other cone-bearing trees. We had broadleaf trees, which were deciduous trees. But these are evergreen broadleaf trees. They have big leaves, but they don't drop them seasonally because there are really no seasons down in the tropics. So there is no reason for these species of trees to develop the adaptation to drop their leaves every fall, because what is fall to a tropical rainforest? There's no such thing. So they're evergreen broadleaf trees. That's what you get in a tropical rainforest. Savannas and deserts, you can see where they're located on in terms of latitude on the maps here. Savannas have much less temperature fluctuation, and these are grasslands, so I've been calling them grasslands in all of the other slides. They have much less temperature fluctuation, which allows grasses to be able to survive very, very well. Grasses do not do well when you have freezing temperatures one moment and then boiling hot temperatures the next moment. Whereas in deserts, the dominant vegetation is going to be succulents like cacti and some woody shrubs as well as some plant life that has a lot of oils in the worked into the plant leaf structure, which also helps them kind of resist those temperature changes. I believe I've said it before, but water resists fluctuations in temperature change. So if you have a cactus that's filled up with water and it goes freezing at night, it'll take a while for the cactus to reduce its temperature down to be freezing. So storing lots and lots of water inside of itself is a really good way to adapt to the very wild climate that you get inside of deserts. The other thing you can see in the photo to the left of the grasslands is that you get large herbivores, because obviously if the dominant kind of vegetation is grass, then the main kind of animal that you're going to have in that ecosystem is animals that eat grass. So you get hooved mammals, ungulates is what they're referred to as. So you get zebras and you get wildebeests and you get other types of grazing mammals in these areas. And then because there's enough primary production, enough plant matter to support this large population of giant herbivores, you also get large predators. You get lions and these kinds of things. So you can think back to our discussion of the trophic structure of ecosystems. There's enough space in these grasslands to create enough photosynthesis to capture enough energy to support this giant population of herbivores. And then those herbivores are enough to support a large population of lions and jackals and all of these other large predators that you have in these areas. So that's a little bit about different terrestrial biomes that we have across the Earth. And I've mentioned that we are losing biodiversity at every single level that we've discussed it at. We're losing species diversity, genetic diversity, we're losing ecosystem diversity. And one way that you lose ecosystem diversity is that certain vital ecosystems disappear. So what we've mentioned, we're losing coral reefs rapidly, we're losing the rainforest pretty rapidly, wetlands are being filled in and built over pretty rapidly. Those are all disappearing. But another way that ecosystem diversity can be lost is if one ecosystem grows over time. Because the more you have of one ecosystem, the less variety you have overall. And deserts have been getting bigger over time. It's a process called desertification. And it comes from a number of factors. One is from deforestation and the destruction of other types of ecosystems. As we clear away all the vegetation associated with other types of ecosystems, it allows the soil to be washed away in these areas. And what takes over when we don't have a lot of the nutrient-rich soil? Well, the landscape becomes more like a desert under that situation. But we also have historic droughts in a lot of areas. Several different factors are at play for this. One, we overpump groundwater to the point where it can actually deplete natural lakes because natural lakes are refilled by groundwater. So we pump it out for industry and for irrigation and for all these kind of things, and it evaporates away and it can no longer be used to fill in natural ecosystems and these sorts of things. So the land kind of dries out as a result. Another factor is climate change. As the climate changes, temperatures are altering, rainfall patterns also begin to change, and areas that were already very, very dry have been undergoing some of the worst droughts that are on the historical record. So the edges of a lot of large deserts have been expanding. They've been growing and growing and growing as these factors compound. Another way that desertification gets worse is through inappropriate agriculture, either from no crop rotation, where you just use the exact same crops on the same plot of land over and over and over again. Now, the reason why that is a problem is that certain crops pull nutrients, particular nutrients, out of the soil. And if you just use the same crops over and over again, they pull the same nutrients out, same nutrients out, same nutrients out, and then eventually all those nutrients are gone, and that soil can no longer support virtually any kind of plant life. So only very, very few types of plants can possibly grow there anymore, and you're going to have conditions more like a desert where plant life is very, very sparse. You want to rotate your crops because in addition to pulling nutrients out of the soil, plants also will often return nutrients to the soil. So you use a crop that pulls nitrogen out of the soil one year, and then the next season you put a crop that puts nitrogen back in the soil. Or you intersperse crops together. So you could plant clover in between rows of other types of crop, and that will create a nice mix of different things. But without this kind of thought process involved, you can really quickly deplete nutrients from the soil. We also have over-irrigation as an issue, and I've had students ask me before, don't you mean under-irrigation? How could increasing the amount of water applied to soil cause a desert? And it does sound like a paradox, but it's true. Groundwater, which is what we pull up through wells in order to irrigate our crops, has a higher amount of salt content in it than, say, rainwater or a lot of surface water, because it's been down there mixing in the rock. It's picked up ions and salts from the rock layers. So when we spray that groundwater over our crops and then the water evaporates off, or the water is used, the salt remains in the soil. And if you've ever heard the phrase salting the earth, well, if you have too many salts in the soil, plant life can't grow. If you just dump a whole bunch of salt in a house plant, it's not going to be very healthy afterward. So what happens is we essentially, after years and years and years of over-irrigation, putting too much groundwater over the crops, too much of the stuff, we're putting layer and layer and layer of salt into the soil, and that causes a desert-like effect to start build up, where the soil becomes no longer fertile for crops. And so since there's no crops that can hold the soil together anymore, again, it just kind of like blows away in the wind. Think of like the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression, and you get sand left over. So while the vast majority of ecosystems have been decreasing in size through habitat destruction and other types of factors, deserts have actually been getting bigger over time. If you are looking for a topic to look up current events on, this might be something you might be able to find some articles on. It's a pretty interesting one.